The core tension is what happens financially when utility-scale wind and solar farms reach the end of their lifespan. We are unpacking the hidden complexities of decommissioning surety bonds. A surety bond is essentially a giant security deposit right. It guarantees the local government or the landlord isn't left with a field of rusted metal. But pricing these bonds for renewables is incredibly difficult because the market is essentially underwriting the unknown.
Looking at the mechanics of the trade, what is fascinating here is the sheer lack of historical reference points. Traditional surety underwriting relies heavily on decades of enforcement history. If you look at extractive industries like oil and gas underwriters have mature historical loss data sets for plugging and abandoning wells. But renewables simply lack that.
Right. The very first large wave of utility-scale wind assets is really just now moving toward the end of its life. So instead of using deep empirical data, the market is having to rely on internal judgments to figure out what a teardown might actually cost.
Understood. And that is exactly where the risk accelerates. You are relying on variables that can drastically swing over time. We are talking about heavy lift crane rates or the cost of specialist transport and constantly shifting waste disposal rules.
Let's pivot to salvage offsets. The common narrative assumes operators can just sell the scrap metal right. Just subtract the future hypothetical value of copper and steel from the overall cleanup cost.
Exactly. But what happens if commodity prices drop? Or if extracting those materials turns out to be far more complex than a simplified model suggests? Suddenly, that net liability balloons.
Wait, I need to push back on the mechanics here.
Yeah.
We're talking about massive energy conglomerates building these farms. Why would a ballooning cleanup cost or a weak surety bond suddenly cause them to fold?
If we connect this to the bigger structural picture, we hit the principal problem. The entities that actually own these specific wind and solar farms are frequently special purpose vehicles or SPVs.
Right, the SPV. It is essentially a legal wrapper.
Precisely. By the time the asset reaches the end of its life, the SPV's revenue stream has completely dried up. In a stressed scenario, it isn't a pool of recoverable value. It is just a legal shell around a massive liability. So the surety bond might be called upon at the exact moment the operator is unable to reimburse the underwriter.
Which means the underwriter is on the hook. And this exposes a severe duration mismatch. The physical liability to clean up a site lasts for decades, but these surety bonds often renew annually.
Correct. So if an underwriter sees a project struggling and pulls out declining, that renewal forces the operator to find replacement security in a very thin market.
Which could single-handedly destabilize a weaker operator.
And the real danger is these defaults might not happen in isolation.
Because if power prices drop or waste rules tighten, it hits the entire sector at once.
Exactly. The same conditions that weaken operators also make decommissioning more expensive across the board. So instead of one isolated project failing, you see multiple projects going under simultaneously, creating a highly correlated market shock.
So what is the bottom line consequence for you watching this market? It comes down to a regulatory gap. Governments generally just want to ensure some enforceable bond is on file to satisfy initial permitting, but they rarely mandate systematic updates to ensure the bond amount matches the growing real-world costs of decommissioning.
The real danger isn't a sudden dramatic market crash. It is the gradual, silent widening of the gap between the money set aside in the bond and the actual realized cost of teardown. The critical variable the market needs to watch next is the frequency of bond renewal repricing as these older SPVs approach insolvency.
That is the definitive tension. If these SPVs fold and the bonds are massively underpriced, when an entire generation of wind and solar farms needs to be dismantled, who ultimately gets stuck holding the bag for the cleanup? Is it the local taxpayers or the landowners who leased out their property? That is the structural fault line you need to ponder on your own.